Inspector Graves arrived at Little Hampstead Market by noon, his arrival marked by the distinctive sound of the police car's tires crunching over the cobblestones of Hartley Square. He was a man of moderate height, with the kind of face that suggested competence without warmth, the sort of police officer who had learned over 20 years of service that efficiency mattered far more than charm. Behind him came Sergeant Morris, younger and more eager, already pulling out his notebook with the enthusiasm of someone who believed that meticulous record-keeping could solve any puzzle. By this time, the market had transformed entirely. The vendors had abandoned their cheerful displays. The casual autumn shoppers had been ushered away by the earliest police officers on the scene. The square, which minutes earlier had buzzed with the ordinary commerce of village life, now felt like a stage set for tragedy. The body had been covered with a white sheet, and the apricot chrysanthemums remained scattered about the pavement, gradually being trampled by the boots of various constables going about their preliminary investigations. Miss Marple stood near the fountain, ostensibly examining the inscription carved into its stone base, something about the village's founding that she had read countless times before. Her wicker basket sat at her feet, her gloved hands folded before her. To any observer, she would have appeared to be merely another concerned elderly resident, perhaps waiting to give a statement to the police. In reality, she was absorbing the scene with the focused intensity of someone reading a particularly complex novel. Inspector Graves began by establishing the basics. When had Mrs. Hartwell been seen alive? Who had discovered the body? What were the circumstances? The answers came swiftly enough. Mrs. Hartwell had been observed at Eleanor Thornton's flower stall at approximately 10:45. Robert Ashford had found her at 11:40 while walking back from his uncle's produce van. In between those times lay a window of some 55 minutes during which Dorothy Hartwell's life had come to an end. The location itself was significant. Blackthorn Lane was not heavily trafficked. It served as a shortcut for those walking between the market and the residential areas, but it was not the most direct route. The brick walls on either side ran high, creating a somewhat isolated passage despite its proximity to the bustling square. If someone had wished to commit violence against Mrs. Hartwell without immediate witnesses, this lane would have served as an adequate location. Inspector Graves turned his attention to the assembled crowd, his eyes moving from face to face with the measured gaze of someone accustomed to reading guilt and innocence in human expressions. Marcus Webb, the antique dealer, appeared genuinely shocked, his usual vagueness replaced by something closer to bewilderment. Eleanor Thornton was clearly distressed, her hands wringing together as she processed the fact that the flowers she had sold that morning had likely been the last pleasant thing Mrs. Hartwell had touched before her death. Thomas Ashford stood with his arm around his young nephew, whose face still retained that alarming pallor. Then there was James Carmichael, the butcher, who stood with his arms crossed and an expression of barely concealed anger. His jaw was clenched tightly, and his eyes kept darting toward the covered body, with an intensity that suggested something more than mere shock at an unexpected death. Miss Marple noted this. She noted the way his fingers flexed involuntarily, the tight set of his shoulders, the particular quality of his breathing. One might have expected a man of his profession to react to death with less emotional volatility, yet Mr. Carmichael seemed genuinely agitated. But it was the absence of certain individuals that caught Miss Marple's attention most acutely. Where, she wondered, was Edward Hartwell, Mrs. Hartwell's son? He was known to be in the village. She had seen his car parked at the Hartwell residence just the previous afternoon, where were Mrs. Hartwell's close friends, women of her social circle who would presumably have attended the market. And where, more intriguingly, was Geoffrey Winters, the new vicar who had taken up the position at St. Mary's only 6 months prior. Inspector Graves was now directing his officers to canvass the immediate area, searching for any object that might have caused Mrs. Hartwell's death. The lack of visible wounds suggested that death had come from some form of impact or blunt force, or perhaps, and this was speculative, from some more subtle cause. The presence of the apricot chrysanthemums scattered about suggested that Mrs. Hartwell had been carrying them when she fell or was struck. As the investigation proceeded, Miss Marple found herself drawn to the painting that Marcus Webb had displayed on his stall. It was still there, undisturbed among the other pieces. The oil painting depicted a landscape of considerable skill, a moorland scene with distant hills rendered in soft blues and purples. It was the sort of painting that might attract the attention of a collector, but Miss Marple found herself wondering why it would have provoked such a visible, emotional response in Dorothy Hartwell. The afternoon wore on. Inspector Graves conducted preliminary interviews with the vendors and nearby witnesses. The initial theory, expressed somewhat prematurely to the gathered crowd, was that Mrs. Hartwell had perhaps suffered a fall or a sudden medical episode while walking through the lane. Yet the position of her body, the scattered flowers, and the particular arrangement of the scene suggested something far less accidental. Miss Marple remained in the square, watching, listening, and thinking. The apricot wind of autumn continued to scatter the fallen petals, carrying with them the scent of flowers now forever associated with death. And in her mind, the elderly woman began to weave together the threads of observation that others would overlook. The trembling hands, the absent son, the angry butcher, the vague antique dealer, and a painting that had provoked secrets into the open air. The investigation had truly begun. By early afternoon, the initial shock had begun to crystallize into something more complex, a mixture of curiosity, speculation, and the peculiar thrill that small communities experience when tragedy disrupts their carefully ordered existence. The market vendors had been requested to remain available for questioning, and the square had taken on the atmosphere of a theatrical stage awaiting the next act. Inspector Graves had established a temporary command post near the fountain, where he methodically conducted interviews while his officers photographed the scene and catalogued evidence. It was during these proceedings that Edward Hartwell finally made his appearance. He arrived in a dark Mercedes, parking with the kind of haste that suggested he had driven faster than the village's unspoken speed conventions typically allowed. He was a man in his early 50s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, the managing director of a London investment firm, Miss Marple recalled from village gossip. His face, when he emerged from the vehicle, displayed a complexity of emotions that no single word could adequately capture. Shock, certainly, but also something that might have been guilt, or perhaps relief, or possibly a mixture of both so thoroughly blended that their individual components were indistinguishable. Inspector Graves intercepted him before he could approach the covered body. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see the tension in Edward's shoulders as the inspector spoke to him in low tones. Whatever was being discussed, it provoked a visible reaction. Edward's hands clenched and unclenched repeatedly, and at one point he appeared to be on the verge of saying something before apparently thinking better of it. The interview that followed took place in a small tent that had been erected near the fountain, ostensibly to shield officers and witnesses from the increasingly cold afternoon wind. Miss Marple could not hear the conversation directly, but she observed what she could, the way Edward's face darkened at certain questions, the way he occasionally glanced toward the covered body with an expression that seemed to mix dread with something that might have been anger. When he emerged from the tent some 20 minutes later, his expression had settled into something resembling grim resignation. It was then that James Carmichael approached him. The two men had clearly not intended to meet, and their encounter near the flower stall had all the hallmarks of an unexpected and unwelcome collision. Miss Marple, still positioned near the fountain with her basket at her feet, observed the exchange with careful attention. The butcher said something to Edward, something sharp enough that nearby vendors turned to look. Edward's response was equally heated, though quieter, and the two men separated quickly, the tension between them hanging in the air like an unresolved chord. This was revealing. Miss Marple had lived long enough to understand that antagonism between men often signaled something deeper than simple disagreement. The question was whether their conflict was connected to Mrs. Hartwell. Elle's death, or merely a pre-existing tension that the day's tragedy had brought to the surface. By mid-afternoon, a second significant development occurred. A young woman arrived at the square, ostensibly looking for Eleanor Thornton at the flower stall. She was perhaps 30 years old, with dark hair and an air of quiet distress. This was Catherine Mills, who worked at the village library and was known to be a close friend of Eleanor's. When Eleanor explained what had happened, Catherine's reaction was immediate and visceral. She gripped Eleanor's arm, her face going pale, and she asked several urgent questions about the circumstances of Mrs. Hartwell's death. What was curious, Miss Marple noted, was the specific nature of Catherine's questions. She did not ask the usual inquiries about how or when Mrs. Hartwell had died. Instead, she asked whether Mrs. Hartwell had been alone when she was found, whether anyone had seen her speaking to anyone in particular that morning, and whether anything had been found near her body. These were not the questions of someone making normal conversation about an unexpected tragedy. These were the questions of someone who was searching for specific information, someone who was concerned about particular details. Inspector Graves noticed this as well. He approached Catherine and asked to speak with her privately, and the two of them withdrew to the tent where Edward Hartwell had been questioned. The interview lasted considerably longer than most of the preliminary questioning sessions had lasted. When Catherine emerged, her eyes were red, as though she had been crying or on the verge of tears. As the afternoon light began to shift toward evening, Miss Marple found herself in possession of a constellation of observations that did not yet form a complete pattern, but which suggested the outlines of something complex and troubling. Mrs. Hartwell had been a woman of means, yes, but also a woman whose particular composure and control masked currents of emotion and connection that the village's surface narratives did not fully acknowledge. Her son harbored something, resentment perhaps, or guilt. James Carmichael had some form of conflict with Edward Hartwell. And Catherine Mills, the quiet librarian, had connections to Mrs. Hartwell that went deeper than the casual friendships typically observed in village social arrangements. The painting on Marcus Webb's stall remained, as yet, unexplained. But Miss Marple had noticed that Geoffrey Winters, the new vicar, had arrived while Edward Hartwell was being questioned. He stood near the church notice board, ostensibly checking the date of the evening service, but his attention was fixed on the police operation before him. When he thought no one was observing, his expression was one of considerable concern. As darkness began to gather over Little Hampstead, the investigation took on the quality of a puzzle with too many pieces that did not yet fit together coherently, but which hinted at a larger picture of deception, resentment, and secrets long kept in the shadows. As evening settled over Little Hampstead, the market square took on a melancholic quality that seemed to underscore the gravity of the day's events. The vendor stalls had been dismantled, their canvas coverings folded away, leaving only the rectangular impressions on the pavement where they had stood. The police presence had diminished somewhat, though officers still moved purposefully through the square, conducting additional interviews and securing the perimeter of Blackthorn Lane with yellow tape. Inspector Graves had announced that he would be establishing himself at the village police station for the duration of the investigation, and word had spread quickly that a preliminary autopsy would be conducted that evening to determine the precise cause of Mrs. Hartwell's death. Miss Marple made her way home as the lampposts began to flicker to life, their warm glow casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Her cottage sat at the edge of the village proper, a rambling Victorian structure, surrounded by a garden that she maintained with the kind of meticulous attention that some might have found obsessive. Tonight, however, she found herself unable to settle into her usual evening routine. She prepared herself a light supper, soup and bread, a small portion of cheese, but found that her appetite had diminished considerably. Instead, she settled into her armchair with a cup of tea and allowed her mind to replay the day's observations with the precision of someone reviewing a mathematical proof. The painting, she thought. The painting on Marcus Webb's stall had precipitated something in Dorothy Hartwell, not mere aesthetic appreciation, but recognition of something significant. The question was what the painting depicted, and more importantly, why its image had provoked such a visible emotional response in a woman so practiced at maintaining composure. At precisely 8 o'clock that evening, her telephone rang. It was her old friend Inspector Graves himself, calling with what he described as a courtesy briefing before the formal investigation proceeded further. The cause of death, preliminary examination had suggested, was a cerebral hemorrhage resulting from blunt force trauma to the head. There were no defensive wounds on Mrs. Hartwell's hands, suggesting that she had not struggled against her assailant. She had likely been struck from behind or struck so suddenly that resistance had not been possible. The weapon itself remained unidentified, though the nature of the wound suggested something rounded and heavy. "A curious case, Miss Marple," Inspector Graves said, his voice carrying that particular tone of respect he had developed toward her years of village observations. "The woman appears to have been killed by someone she was not expecting to harm her. There's no sign of struggle, no indication of panic. She was carrying flowers, you understand, which suggests she was in no particular hurry or distress." Miss Marple thanked him for the information and ventured a question about the timeline. Had they determined precisely when death had occurred? The inspector confirmed that the preliminary assessment suggested a death occurring between approximately 10:55 and 11:30, with the most likely window being closer to 11 o'clock. This placed the murder no more than a few minutes after Mrs. Hartwell had last been observed alive. After the telephone conversation concluded, Miss Marple sat with her tea growing cold before her. The timeline was extraordinarily tight. Mrs. Hartwell had purchased flowers at approximately 10:45. She had lingered at Marcus Webb's antique stall, examining the painting. By 11, or shortly thereafter, she was dead. The journey from the Market Square to Blackthorn Lane should have taken no more than 3 minutes at a leisurely pace. This suggested that her killer had either been among those she encountered at the market, or someone who had followed her, or someone who had been waiting in the lane with foreknowledge that she would pass through. The next morning brought new developments. Inspector Graves convened a more formal gathering of those who had been present at the market on the previous day. This took place in the village hall, a modest stone building that occasionally served as a meeting space for the community. Nearly 40 people had been present in Hartley Square when Mrs. Hartwell was murdered, and Graves was determined to conduct more thorough interviews with as many as possible. Miss Marple attended, ostensibly as a concerned citizen who had witnessed the events. She sat toward the back of the hall, her knitting in her lap, a sweater in a soft grey wool that she had been working on for several weeks. To any observer, she appeared to be merely an elderly woman occupying herself with needlework while waiting to give her statement. In reality, she was observing every interaction, every hesitation, every glance exchanged between individuals. It was during these interviews that something significant occurred. When Inspector Graves questioned Geoffrey Winters, the new vicar, about his movements on the previous morning, the man's response was oddly evasive. He admitted that he had not been in the market square during the relevant time period, but when asked where he had been, he became vague and uncomfortable. He eventually stated that he had been visiting a parishioner in need of spiritual counsel, but when pressed for specifics, he declined to provide the name, citing confidentiality. This raised questions. Inspector Graves pursued the matter, but Winters remained steadfast, and ultimately the inspector was forced to accept the man's explanation, however unsatisfying it proved. However, Miss Marple noted something that the inspector might have missed. When Winters mentioned his pastoral duties, his eyes flicked briefly toward Edward Hartwell, who was sitting several seats away, waiting for his own more detailed interview. That glance lasted perhaps 2 seconds, but it communicated something. Complicity, perhaps. Shared knowledge. A secret held in common. Midday, the formal interviews had yielded little in the way of concrete evidence, but considerable psychological texture. James Carmichael's antagonism toward Edward Hartwell had apparently been connected to a business dispute from years previous. Eleanor Thornt seemed to harbor some concern about information Mrs. Hartwell had possessed regarding the flower vendor's personal affairs. And Catherine Mills, when questioned more extensively, admitted that she had been helping Mrs. Hartwell with some sort of research project involving local history and family records. As Miss Marple walked home that afternoon, she found herself thinking about the nature of secrets. In small villages, secrets were never truly private. They leaked, they spread, they created currents of tension that astute observers could detect. The question now was not whether Mrs. Hartwell had possessed dangerous knowledge, but rather which of her secrets had proven dangerous enough to warrant her silencing. The following day brought rain to Little Hampstead, the sort of persistent autumn drizzle that seemed to seep into one's very bones and dampen not merely the streets, but the spirits of the villagers who inhabited them. Inspector Graves had set up a more permanent investigation base at the police station, and word had circulated that he was awaiting the results of more detailed forensic analysis on the clothing and personal effects found near Mrs. Hartwell's body. Meanwhile, the village itself had begun to transform under the weight of speculation and suspicion. Neighbors who had been cordial for years now regarded each other with newfound wariness. The usual patterns of village life, the casual conversations at the post office, the friendly exchanges in the grocery shop, had become strained and guarded. Miss Marple had spent the previous evening conducting what she termed to herself historical research, though it was actually something far more deliberate than that. She had retrieved from her shelves several volumes dealing with Little Hampstead's past, as well as copies of old parish records that she had collected over the years. She had then sat at her writing desk, making notes with a fountain pen in her small, precise handwriting. By the time she had finished, sometime after midnight, a pattern had begun to emerge, not yet complete, but suggestive enough to warrant further investigation. The painting, she had concluded, was the key. Not the painting itself, but what it represented. Mrs. Hartwell's reaction to it had been one of recognition, certainly, but recognition of what? A place? A person? A moment in time that held significance? On the third day after the murder, Miss Marple made her way to the village library. Catherine Mills was working at the front desk, cataloguing new acquisitions with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was using the work as a distraction from more troubling thoughts. She looked up as Miss Marple entered, and a flicker of something, surprise perhaps or concern, crossed her features. "Miss Marple," Catherine said, setting down her pen. "What brings you in on such a dreary day?" Miss Marple approached the desk with her characteristic slowness, taking her time to navigate the distance. This was partly genuine infirmity, but partly also calculated theatre. People, she had learned, often felt more comfortable speaking with someone they perceived as frail and unthreatening. "I was wondering," Miss Marple began, her voice carrying the diffident tone of someone making a tentative inquiry, "whether you might be able to help me locate some materials. I'm interested in the history of the old estates in our area, particularly those that might have changed hands during the 1950s and 1960s. Family matters, you understand. My curiosity about local genealogy has been growing." This was, in fact, only partially true. Her interest was in genealogy, but of a very specific sort. Catherine, however, seemed pleased to have a request that appeared to be straightforward and innocent. She led Miss RPLE to the local history section, where she pulled several volumes from the shelves and made recommendations regarding what other resources might prove useful. As they stood together among the books, Miss Marple ventured another question. "I understand you were quite close to Mrs. Hartwell," she said gently. "It must be dreadfully difficult for you, all of this business." Catherine's hands stilled. She was quiet for a long moment before responding. "She was a remarkable woman," Catherine said finally. "People didn't understand her. They saw the surface, the propriety, the control, the judgment. But underneath all of that was someone who had experienced considerable tragedy and had managed to construct a life from the fragments." "What sort of tragedy?" Miss Marple asked, her tone one of genuine curiosity rather than interrogation. Catherine hesitated, clearly conflicted between her loyalty to the deceased woman and her natural inclination to answer a direct question. Finally, she said, "That's not really my story to tell, but if you're interested in local history, you might want to look at the records from the Ashford estate. There was a significant legal dispute around 1958. It might be relevant to your genealogical interests." The Ashford estate. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Thomas Ashford was a current vendor at the market, as was his nephew Robert. The connection was beginning to take shape. Over the following 2 days, Miss Marple conducted a series of seemingly casual conversations with various villagers. She spoke with Eleanor Thornton about the flower business, and more specifically, about Eleanor's family history. She encountered Marcus Webb at the market, which had resumed its operations with a certain awkward solemnity, and inquired about the painting on his stall, expressing interest in purchasing it for her cottage wall. She even managed. Ed, a conversation with Geoffrey Winters after Sunday service, discussing parish matters while subtly directing questions toward his recent arrival in the village and his interactions with various parishioners. What emerged from these conversations was a pattern of connections that had previously remained obscure. The Ashford family had experienced significant financial difficulties in the late 1950s, difficulties that had been resolved through the intervention of a mysterious benefactor. Eleanor Thornton's mother had been employed as a nurse during a particular period in the 1950s. Geoffrey Winters, it transpired, had been educated at boarding school with Edward Hartwell, a connection they had apparently maintained throughout adulthood. And the painting on Marcus Webb's stall depicted, upon closer inspection, a particular moorland landscape that was identifiable as being located near the old Ashford estate. On the fourth evening after the murder, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk once again and composed a careful note to Inspector Graves. In it, she outlined her observations and made a specific request. She believed, she wrote, that the investigation might benefit from a closer examination of events that had occurred in Little Hampstead during the years 1955 to 1960, and she suggested several individuals whose backgrounds during that period might warrant scrutiny. She also requested that the inspector inquire whether Mrs. Hartwell had, at any point during her life, worked in a nursing capacity or possessed knowledge of medical or pharmaceutical matters. The note was deliberately vague, avoiding any direct accusation while pointing toward the direction in which her suspicions lay. She posted it that evening, and by the following morning it had reached Inspector Graves's desk. What happened next would set the investigation on an entirely new course. Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's cottage on a grey Thursday morning, his expression one of professional interest, mixed with a curiosity that suggested Miss Marple's letter had provoked something more than routine investigation. He sat in her parlour, accepting tea with the politeness of a man who had learned that accepting such hospitality often facilitated more candid conversations. Sergeant Morris remained outside, conducting preliminary inquiries with the neighbours, a standard precaution that seemed almost quaint in the context of what was about to be discussed. "Your letter was intriguing," Graves said, settling into the armchair with his teacup. "Particularly your suggestion regarding Mrs. Hartwell's possible medical background. We had assumed she was simply a woman of means, the widow of a solicitor. But our initial inquiries suggest something rather different. She did, in fact, possess nursing credentials obtained in 1952. She worked at a private clinic in Sussex for several years, before apparently retiring to village life." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, as though this information merely confirmed what she had already deduced. In truth, she had strongly suspected it, but confirmation was always preferable to assumption, and her work at this clinic, she ventured, would have coincided with the period when the Ashford family experienced their financial difficulties? Remarkably precise observation, Graves acknowledged. He pulled a notebook from his pocket. "We've discovered that Thomas Ashford's sister, Edward's mother, died in 1958. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but the circumstances were apparently somewhat unusual. She was cared for privately, at the family home, rather than in a hospital. The attending physician was a Dr. Hartwell, who we now believe was related to our victim." This was the confirmation Miss Marple had been waiting for. Dorothy Hartwell had not merely been a casual observer of village life. She had been intimately connected to one of the significant traumas that had shaped the community's recent history. And what was the nature of this unusual circumstance? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew. Graves leaned forward slightly. "According to what we've been able to piece together, Edward's mother, Catherine Ashford, had been battling severe depression following the financial collapse of the family estate. There was significant concern about her mental state in the months before her death. Dr. Hartwell's wife, Dorothy, was apparently called upon to provide nursing care. The woman's death occurred rather suddenly, and while there was no formal investigation at the time, certain parties have hinted that there may have been questions about the exact circumstances. The implication hung in the air between them like a suspended cord, waiting to be resolved." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation. "You are suggesting that Mrs. Hartwell may have been involved in something that could have been construed as hastening Mrs. Ashford's death?" "I'm suggesting," Graves said carefully, "that Mrs. Hartwell may have possessed knowledge about events that certain people in this village would have preferred remain buried, particularly if that knowledge could have been weaponized as blackmail or used to undermine reputations that have been carefully constructed over the past few decades." This was the moment at which the investigation shifted from historical curiosity into present-day motive and danger. If Mrs. Hartwell had possessed knowledge of a death that was not entirely natural, if she had maintained this knowledge through decades of village life, the question became not merely whether she had been murdered, but by whom and why now, after so many years of silence. "The is something else," Graves continued, and his tone had become significantly more grave. "We've discovered correspondence between Mrs. Hartwell and Catherine Mills. Letters in which Mrs. Hartwell appears to have been revealing information about the Ashford matter to Catherine in recent months. Catherine claims that she was assisting Mrs. Hartwell with what she terms reconciliation, though the exact nature of this reconciliation remains unclear." Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she lifted her teacup once more. Whether from emotion or merely the chill of the morning, she could not have said with certainty. Catherine Mills assisting with reconciliation suggested that whatever burden Mrs. Hartwell had carried, she had apparently decided that the time for revelation had come. The question was whether this decision had precipitated her death. "I believe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that Mrs. Hartwell may have intended to make certain revelations public. The painting on Marcus Webb's stall, I would suggest that it may have belonged to the Ashford estate. Seeing it, perhaps after many years, reminded Mrs. Hartwell of what she had witnessed, what she knew. Perhaps she had decided that silence was no longer tenable." Graves was quiet for a moment, processing this. "If that's the case, then we need to determine who, among those with knowledge of the Ashford situation, would have had the most to lose from such revelations. Edward Hartwell certainly. His legitimacy as a son might be questioned if his mother had hastened his own mother's death. James Carmichael worked for the Ashford estate as a young man, I wonder. What he might have witnessed. And Geoffrey Winters, his connection to Edward Hartwell dates back decades. They may have shared secrets. There is also the matter of Thomas Ashford himself," Miss Marple observed. "He lost his sister in circumstances that may not have been entirely straightforward. That loss changed his family's fortunes. One must consider what knowledge he might have carried all these years." As Graves stood to leave, having obtained the clarification he required, Miss Marple offered one final observation. "The apricot chrysanthemums," she said. "Mrs. Hartwell purchased them from Eleanor Thornton. Eleanor's mother, I believe, was connected to the Ashford household in some capacity. Mrs. Hartwell may have been attempting to communicate something through that choice of flowers, some connection to the past." After Graves had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, the autumn rain continuing its persistent patter against the windows. The case was no longer a simple matter of a stranger committing violence. It had become something far more complex, a question of how long buried secrets could remain concealed, and what price would be paid by those who finally decided to speak truth aloud. The revelation of Mrs. Hartwell's nursing background and her connection to the Ashford family's tragedy sent tremors through Little Hampstead that were both subtle and profound. Inspector Graves, operating with the kind of methodical efficiency that characterized his investigative approach, began conducting more targeted interviews with those who had connections to the events of the 1950s. The village, meanwhile, seemed to retreat into itself, as though the collective consciousness had recognized that dangerous knowledge was circulating in its streets, and that speaking carelessly might expose one's own vulnerabilities. It was on the Friday following Graves' visit to Miss Marple's cottage that a second significant development occurred. Thomas Ashford, the produce vendor, whose family had been at the center of the historical tragedy, appeared at the police station of his own volition. He requested an interview with Inspector Graves and spent nearly 2 hours in the station's interrogation room before emerging with an expression that suggested he had divested himself of a considerable burden. The nature of what Thomas had revealed became partially evident when Eleanor Thornton unexpectedly closed her flower store for the day and made her way to the police station as well. The two visits were clearly connected, though neither Thomas nor Eleanor initially revealed the specific contents of their statements to the village at large. However, Miss Marple, who had made it her business to observe the comings and goings at the police station from a discreet distance, noted that both individuals seemed to have reached some form of resolution. Eleanor's eyes were red from crying, but her expression carried a certain relief, as though she had finally unburdened herself of a truth that had weighed upon her for decades. That evening, Geoffrey Winters made an appointment to speak with Inspector Graves. The vicar arrived at the police station in clerical collar and cassock, his usual composed demeanor somewhat diminished. His interview lasted considerably longer than those of Thomas or Eleanor, and when he emerged, he looked not merely troubled but genuinely shaken. He went directly to the church, where Miss Marple, who had followed him with the kind of patient persistence that had served her well throughout her investigative endeavors, observed him sitting alone in the sanctuary for over an hour before departing. By Saturday morning, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align in ways that Miss Marple could now perceive with considerable clarity. The narrative that was emerging from the police investigation was not the simple matter of a recent crime springing from a singular motive. Instead, it was a complex tapestry of interconnected deceptions, moral compromises, and shared secrets that had bound certain individuals together across decades. Inspector Graves made an unexpected visit to Miss Marple's cottage that afternoon. He carried with him a leather portfolio containing various documents, old medical records, correspondence, and photographs from the Ashford family archives. He spread these before her on her writing desk with the air of someone who was seeking confirmation of conclusions he had already reached. "What we've uncovered," Graves began, "is that the death of Catherine Ashford in 1958 was not, in fact, a natural death. She had been diagnosed with terminal cancer some months before her death. However, the progression of the disease was accelerated by certain pharmaceutical interventions administered by Dorothy Hartwell, who was at that time serving as her nurse. Dorothy's husband, Dr. Hartwell, was aware of this, but did nothing to prevent it. The ostensible reason was mercy. Catherine was in considerable pain and had expressed a desire not to linger. However, the family's financial crisis at that time created an additional motivation. Miss Marple listened carefully, absorbing this information and contextualizing it within the broader framework she had constructed. The Ashford estate was in danger of being seized due to debts, she said, understanding now why Thomas had gone to the police. Mrs. Hartwell's actions, however they might be morally justified as merciful, were also financially convenient for the family. "Precisely," Graves confirmed. "What's more, Eleanor Thornton's mother was working in the household at the time. She witnessed certain things that she never publicly disclosed, but which she apparently confided to her daughter. Eleanor has been carrying this knowledge for years, as has Thomas Ashford. Both have now decided that the time for silence has ended." "And Geoffrey Winters?" Miss Marple inquired. Graves' expression hardened slightly. Geoffrey Winters knew about the circumstances of Catherine Ashford's death because Edward Hartwell told him. They had been friends since their school days, and Edward apparently unburdened himself to Geoffrey regarding his knowledge of his mother's involvement in hastening his own mother's death. Winters kept this secret for decades, bound by friendship and by his own position in the community. However, when he discovered that Mrs. Hartwell had begun revealing these secrets to Catherine Mills, he became concerned about what might be revealed regarding his own knowledge of events. This was the psychological mechanism at the heart of the crime, Miss Marple realized. Not a single blow struck in momentary passion, but rather a calculated act designed to prevent the revelation of secrets that multiple people had invested their entire lives in maintaining. The question now was which of these individuals had actually struck the fatal blow. Mrs. Hartwell was apparently planning to provide a written account of the events surrounding Catherine Ashford's death, Graves continued. Catherine Mills was assisting her in this project. The account was meant to be placed with a solicitor, to be opened after Mrs. Hartwell's death. However, someone learned of this plan and decided that Mrs. Hartwell must be silenced before she could put pen to paper. Miss Marple rose from her chair and walked to the window, looking out at the grey November afternoon. The apricot chrysanthemums had long since faded, but their ghost remained in her memory, those flowers that Mrs. Hartwell had. Purchased in the final hour of her life, perhaps as a deliberate gesture of connection to the past, or perhaps merely as an unconscious manifestation of the emotions churning beneath her composed exterior. The blow was struck from behind, she observed, not as a question but as a statement. Mrs. Hartwell did not see her killer approaching. This suggests someone she trusted, or at least someone she did not fear, someone she would not have expected to harm her. That, Graves said, is precisely what we are attempting to determine. We have narrowed the list of suspects considerably, but the final confirmation requires understanding not merely who had the knowledge and opportunity, but who had the psychological capacity to commit such an act. Miss Marple turned back from the window, her ancient eyes sharp and penetrating. "Then we must construct a test," she said quietly. "We must place the killer in a situation where their guilt becomes apparent through their own reactions." Inspector Graves regarded Miss Marple with an expression of mingled respect and caution. He understood what she was suggesting, a psychological trap, carefully constructed to expose guilt through involuntary reaction. It was unconventional methodology, the sort of approach that modern police procedure tended to discourage. Yet he also recognized that Miss Marple's understanding of human nature had proven remarkably reliable throughout her life in Little Hampstead. "What did you have in mind?" Graves asked, settling back into his chair with the air of someone who, despite his official training, had learned to trust the instincts of an elderly woman who had spent decades observing the village's inhabitants. Miss Marple considered the question carefully before responding. "We must reconstruct the events of that Saturday morning in the market. We must gather the relevant individuals and, through care, fully orchestrated conversation and observation, create a situation in which the guilty party will inadvertently reveal themselves. The human conscience, Inspector, is a remarkable instrument. It rarely allows guilt to remain entirely concealed when confronted with the weight of truth. Over the next several days, the machinery of the investigation shifted subtly. Inspector Graves continued his formal questioning, but his approach became more focused, less accusatory, more inviting of confidential disclosure. He interviewed Edward Hartwell again, this time with the knowledge that Edward had been aware of his mother's role in hastening his own mother's death, a burden that must have weighed heavily upon him across the decades. He spoke again with James Carmichael, whose antagonism toward Edward seemed to stem from something deeper than mere business disagreement. He met once more with Geoffrey Winters, the clergyman who had chosen to conceal knowledge that his conscience must have troubled him with considerable frequency. The investigation had, by this point, extended to a full week following Mrs. Hartwell's death. The village had begun to settle into a kind of grim accommodation, with the notion that murder had occurred in its midst. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a more complex emotional landscape in which suspicion, curiosity, and the desire for resolution competed with one another. It was Miss Marple who suggested the gathering. She proposed that a small reception be held at the village hall, ostensibly to honor Mrs. Hartwell's memory and to allow the community to come together in shared grief. Inspector Graves, understanding the actual purpose of the gathering, agreed to the arrangement and ensured that several plainclothes officers would be present to observe the proceedings. The reception was scheduled for the following Saturday, precisely 2 weeks after. The murder. In the days leading up to the gathering, Miss Marple made several strategic visits. She called upon Catherine Mills and, in a carefully orchestrated conversation about the history of the village, mentioned casually that she had been examining old parish records and had discovered some fascinating details about the Ashford family's circumstances in the 1950s. She visited Marcus Webb's antique stall and inquired about the Moreland painting, expressing her intention to purchase it as a memorial to Mrs. Hartwell, a gesture, she said, toward honoring the connections between past and present. She even managed a conversation with Edward Hartwell, in which she recalled, with the gentle nostalgia of age, how Mrs. Hartwell had always seemed to carry some invisible burden, some weight of knowledge that separated her from the ordinary concerns of village life. Each conversation was carefully constructed to plant seeds of anxiety in the consciousness of those who had something to fear from revelation. Each was designed to reinforce the understanding that the truth was emerging, that silence was no longer tenable, that the past could not remain indefinitely buried. The Saturday of the reception arrived with clear skies and weak autumn sunlight. The village hall had been decorated with flowers and photographs of Mrs. Hartwell at various stages of her life, as a young woman, as a wife and mother, as the composed figure that the village had known in her later years. A small reception was arranged, with tea and biscuits, and gradually the relevant individuals began to arrive. Thomas Ashford came with Eleanor Thornton, the two of them moving together with the ease of people who had recently shared a significant emotional experience. Geoffrey Winters attended in his clerical capacity, his presence lending a certain gravitas to the proceedings. Edward Hartwell arrived somewhat utter, his expression guarded and his body language suggesting considerable internal tension. Catherine Mills was present as well, her role as Mrs. Hartwell's confidant lending her a particular significance in the gathering. Miss Marple circulated through the hall with her characteristic unhurried pace, engaging in quiet conversations and making careful observations. At one point, she positioned herself near the refreshment table with Eleanor Thornton and, in a voice carefully pitched to be overheard by others, began to discuss how remarkable it was that Mrs. Hartwell had apparently been planning to document certain historical events before her death. How important it was, she observed, that truth eventually emerged from the shadows, regardless of how long it had been concealed. The reaction was immediate and profound. Edward Hartwell's hand, reaching for a teacup, trembled noticeably. Geoffrey Winter's face paled significantly. But it was James Carmichael whose response was most telling. He had been standing near the edge of the gathering, apparently observing the proceedings without active participation. At Miss Marple's words, his entire body went rigid. His hands clenched into fists, and his face flushed with an intensity of emotion that suggested something far more profound than mere discomfort. Inspector Graves, positioned discreetly near the doorway, noticed this reaction with the trained eye of a professional investigator. He exchanged the briefest of glances with one of his plainclothes officers, and Miss Marple knew that the moment of revelation was approaching. The test had not yet been fully constructed, but already it was yielding results. The guilty conscience, like a creature cornered, was beginning to show signs of its own awareness that concealment was no longer possible. James Carmichael's reaction had not gone unnoticed by others in the room. Severa. Heads turned in his direction, and a subtle current of awareness seemed to ripple through the gathering. The butcher, recognizing that his emotional response had exposed him to scrutiny, made an abrupt movement toward the door, apparently intending to leave the reception. Inspector Graves, however, positioned himself with casual deliberation between Carmichael and the exit, effectively blocking his departure without making any overt gesture that would have appeared confrontational. "Mr. Carmichael," Miss Marple said, her voice carrying that particular quality of gentle authority that she had cultivated over decades of village observation, "I wonder if you might join me for a moment. I should very much like to discuss your recollections of the Ashford household. You worked there as a young man, did you not?" The directness of the question, combined with the fact that it was asked by someone whom Carmichael could not reasonably refuse without appearing suspicious, placed him in an impossible position. He hesitated, his jaw working as though he was struggling with something internal before finally turning back toward the refreshment area where Miss Marple stood. "I'm not certain what you mean to imply," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Whatever happened in the Ashford household 60 years ago has nothing to do with me. I was merely employed there as a groundskeeper. I knew nothing of family matters." Miss Marple regarded him with eyes that seemed to penetrate the carefully constructed facade he had maintained throughout his adult life. "Yet you had a great deal of difficulty concealing your distress when I mentioned Mrs. Hartwell's intention to document historical events. A curious reaction, Mr. Carmichael, if you truly knew nothing of significance." The gathering had grown quiet. Conversations that had been occurring in various corners of the hall had ceased, and the assembled individuals had become an audience to something more consequential than a simple memorial reception. Edward Hartwell watched with an expression of growing understanding. Geoffrey Winters appeared to be wrestling with some internal conflict. Catherine Mills leaned forward slightly, her librarian's mind apparently engaged with the unfolding revelation. Mrs. Hartwell, Miss Marple continued, maintaining her gentle but inexorable tone, spent her final morning at the market observing a painting on Marcus Webb's antique stall. A painting depicting a moorland landscape near the Ashford estate. That painting had belonged to the Ashford family, had it not? It had been hung in Mrs. Hartwell's presence when she worked there as a nurse, caring for Catherine Ashford. Carmichael's silence was response enough. His face had darkened further, and his hands had begun to shake with barely suppressed emotion. "You were there," Miss Marple said, and now her voice had taken on a quality of certainty that brooked no contradiction. "You witnessed what occurred in that household. You saw Dorothy Hartwell administer the medication that hastened Catherine Ashford's death. And you may have even understood, on some level, that this act, however merciful it might be construed, was also financially convenient for the family that employed you. You remained silent, as did Eleanor's mother before her, as did so many others who suspected truth but chose not to speak it aloud." "That's enough," Carmichael said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "You don't understand what it was like. You don't understand the circumstances, the complexities of what occurred in that house. Then explain them to us," Inspector Graves said, his voice now official and unmistakable in its authority. He had moved slightly closer, and the plainclothes officers near the doorway had positioned themselves to prevent any sudden departure. "Explain, Mr. Carmichael, why you felt compelled to silence Mrs. Hartwell permanently when she began to reveal secrets that you believed should remain concealed." The accusation hung in the air between them, and for a moment it seemed as though Carmichael might attempt to make a dash for the door. His body tensed, his eyes darted toward the exit. But then, as suddenly as the moment of potential violence had arisen, it dissipated. The butcher's shoulders sagged, and he sank into one of the folding chairs that had been arranged throughout the hall for the reception. "I loved her," he said finally, his voice breaking with the weight of emotions he had apparently been suppressing for an extraordinarily long time. "Catherine Ashford. I was young, barely 20, working as a groundskeeper. She was kind to me, the only person in that household who treated me as though I were a human being rather than merely hired labor. When she became ill, I watched her waste away. I watched the family's coldness toward her, their calculation regarding her death, and what it would mean for their circumstances." He looked up at Miss Marple, and his eyes held something between anguish and resignation. "I didn't prevent it. I should have. I should have gone to someone, told someone what I suspected. But I was young and afraid, and I didn't understand what was happening clearly enough to articulate it to anyone who might have acted. By the time I understood, truly understood, it was too late. She was gone. And Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Marple said gently, "who had played a role in that death, carried knowledge of your knowledge. She understood somehow what you had witnessed and what you had failed to do. Perhaps she even thought of you over the years, wondering whether you would ever come forward with what you knew, when she began to prepare to leave. The truth about Catherine Ashford's death, you became afraid. Afraid that your own complicity, your silence, your failure to act, would be exposed. Afraid that the truth would destroy the carefully constructed life you had built. She was going to tell everyone," Carmichael said, his voice hollow. "She was going to write it all down, make it official. She was going to name me, describe how I had stood by and done nothing while a woman I had loved was hastened to her grave. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't bear for everyone to know what a coward I had been." The confession hung in the quiet hall, and Inspector Graves stepped forward to place a hand on Carmichael's shoulder, reading him his rights with the formal precision that the law required, even in moments of such profound human tragedy. The confession of James Carmichael seemed to drain something essential from the village hall itself. The gathering, which had moments before been an orderly memorial reception, transformed into something resembling a community in shock. Inspector Graves guided the butcher from the hall with the kind of professional courtesy that suggested sympathy even as it enforced the demands of justice. The plainclothes officers followed, ensuring that proper procedures were observed and that the chain of evidence remained unbroken. What remained was a silence so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. The mourners, if they could still be called that, stood in various states of emotional displacement. Eleanor Thornton had begun to weep quietly, her tears apparently stemming from the complex mixture of relief that the truth had finally emerged and sorrow for the human costs that truth had extracted. Geoffrey Winters sat with his head bowed, apparently engaged in some form of private spiritual reckoning. Edward Hartwell stood with an expression that might have been described as calm, placated, perhaps understanding, perhaps a kind of sorrowful recognition that the secrets his family had maintained, across decades, had ultimately consumed far more than they had ever protected. Miss Marple remained standing near the refreshment table, her posture unchanged despite the emotional turbulence that had swept through the room. She appeared to be observing the aftermath of revelation, with the detached contemplation of someone accustomed to bearing witness to human complexity without losing her emotional equilibrium. Catherine Mills approached her, and the two women exchanged a glance that seemed to communicate understanding between them. The understanding of those who had recognized before others that truth, however painful, was ultimately preferable to the continuation of constructed falsehoods. Mrs. Hartwell knew, Catherine said quietly. She must have known about James and Catherine Ashford, the love, I mean. She must have understood that he had remained silent out of love, out of grief, out of the kind of emotional paralysis that accompanies witnessing tragedy. One is powerless to prevent. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Mrs. Hartwell was a woman of considerable psychological insight, she replied. She had worked in nursing, you understand. She would have been trained to recognize the subtle ways that trauma manifests itself in human behavior. I suspect she understood James far better than he realized, which may have complicated her moral calculus regarding what she intended to reveal. Knowledge is a burden, Miss Mills. Knowledge of human suffering, of human complicity, of the ways that ordinary people are sometimes forced by circumstance into positions that compromise their integrity. Such knowledge weighs upon the conscience in particular ways. The police had transported Carmichael to the station, where he would undergo formal processing. Inspector Grave S. would oversee the completion of the investigation, ensuring that the physical evidence aligned with the confession, that forensic analysis confirmed what psychological observation had revealed. The wound on Mrs. Hartwell's head would be consistent with blunt force trauma from an object that Graves had already recovered from Carmichael's home, a lead weight that had been part of a doorstop in the butcher's front hallway, an ordinary domestic object transformed into an instrument of violence by circumstance and desperation. By evening, as darkness fell over Little Hampstead and the village hall was gradually emptied of mourners, Miss Marple found herself alone with Inspector Graves in the nearly deserted space. The inspector had returned to conduct a final debrief, to reconstruct the sequence of events that had culminated in Mrs. Hartwell's death, and to ensure that the investigation could proceed toward its formal conclusion. "How did you know?" Graves asked, his tone one of genuine curiosity rather than professional interrogation. "At what point did you recognize that Carmichael was the one who had killed her?" Miss Marple settled herself into one of the folding chairs, an acknowledgement that the evening's events had, despite her composed demeanor, required considerable expenditure of her limited physical reserves. "I didn't know with certainty," she replied thoughtfully. "What I recognized was a pattern of emotional displacement. Mr. Carmichael's antagonism toward Edward Hartwell was never truly about business matters, was it? It was about something far more personal, about witnessing Catherine Ashford's death through Edward's negligence, about harboring resentment toward a family that had profited from tragedy." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the care she typically applied to such significant articulations. "When you revealed to me that Mrs. Hartwell had been..." "I'm planning to document the circumstances of Catherine Ashford's death. I recognized that this would represent a genuine threat to anyone who had been complicit in concealing those circumstances. But the threat would be most acute for someone who had been emotionally invested in that death, someone for whom silence had represented not merely protection of reputation, but also a way of managing grief and guilt across decades. And the painting? Graves prompted. The painting served as a catalyst, Miss Marple explained. It reminded Mrs. Hartwell, quite literally reminded her through visual association, of the household where she had witnessed Catherine Ashford's final days. That reminder apparently crystallized her determination to speak truth. When I mentioned, quite deliberately, that Mrs. Hartwell had been planning to document these historical events, I was essentially signaling to everyone present that revelation was imminent. The guilty party would respond most acutely to that information, not those guilty of passive silence, but those guilty of active complicity, or those who harbored other emotional investments in the secret remaining concealed. Inspector Graves absorbed this explanation, nodding slowly, and Carmichael's reaction was that of a man suddenly confronted with the imminent destruction of a carefully constructed emotional architecture, Miss Marple finished. He had spent 60 years managing his grief regarding Catherine Ashford's death and his guilt regarding his own failure to prevent it. The revelation of what had actually occurred, made public through Mrs. Hartwell's intended documentation, would have destroyed the narrative he had constructed to make that failure bearable. It would have transformed his silence from protective discretion into complicity with murder. For a man of his emotional disposition, that transformation was intolerable. As Graves prepared to depart, leaving Miss Marple alone in the gradually cooling village hall, she found herself reflecting on the nature of secrets and the price that communities sometimes paid for maintaining them. James Carmichael had killed to preserve silence, but Mrs. Hartwell had died because she had finally decided that silence could no longer be preserved, and the village itself had been transformed by the revelation of truths that had lurked beneath its surface for 6 decades. The weeks that followed Mrs. Hartwell's death and James Carmichael's arrest witnessed a gradual return to normalcy in Little Hampstead, though the village was never quite the same. The market resumed its Saturday operations, though the emotional tenor had changed fundamentally. The vendors who assembled in Hartley Square now did so with a heightened awareness of the fragility of community, the way that seemingly stable social structures could collapse under the weight of long-concealed truths. The legal proceedings moved with the inexorable momentum of the English judicial system. James Carmichael, initially resistant to the full implications of his crime, eventually accepted legal counsel that acknowledged his guilt while attempting to contextualize it within the framework of his decades-long emotional struggle. The prosecution presented their case methodically, forensic evidence linking the lead doorstop to the wound on Mrs. Hartwell's head, witness testimony regarding Carmichael's movements on the morning of the murder, and the confession itself, recorded and authenticated according to proper procedures. Yet it was the psychological testimony that seemed to resonate most profoundly with those who followed the trial. Experts were called to describe how unresolved trauma, harbored across 60 years, could potentially precipitate otherwise unprovoked violence. The love that Carmichael had carried for Catherine Ashford, a love that had never been articulated, never been acknowledged in the presence of the woman herself, had transformed into something far more complex over the decades. It had become guilt, resentment, and finally, desperate protection of a narrative that he had constructed to make his own complicity bearable. The sentencing, when it came, reflected this complexity. Carmichael received a prison term that acknowledged the gravity of his crime while also recognizing the extraordinary circumstances of his psychological